survive only in people's minds and in old documents, the muggletonians survived until 4 years ago. And as a result of historical hunch, sheer chance, and human devotion, historians can now study them on the basis of their own complete records, a rare historical treasure trove. Let Simon Winchester tell the story.
An apple orchard deep in the Weald of Kent, a few miles from Tunbridge Wells, a pleasantly rural setting for one of the most extraordinary historical discoveries to be made in England for years. Only very rarely do major historical treasures come to light. The idea that piles of ancient, dusty documents revealing forgotten and astonishing mysteries of the past are still waiting to be found is dismissed by most historians as the stuff of romantic fiction. But here, in these farm outbuildings, fiction has become fact. Mrs. Jean Barsley and Professor William Lamont, a historian from Sussex University, are visiting the only surviving contemporary portrait of an English tailor whose name was given to a religious sect that flourished from its foundation in the 1650s until as recently as 1979, and it may even survive today.
It's in here.
I see.
And then we have to go in where the boys will sign.
Oh. Whereabouts is it? Oh, here. All right.
Very dusty.
See anything there? Oh,
Somebody's coming.
there he is.
The name of this giant tailor, he stood well over 6 feet tall, was Lodowick Muggleton. His followers, currently the subject of close academic scrutiny, are known by the faintly ludicrous name of the Muggletonians. This portrait belonged to the man who owned the farm, Philip Noakes. He died in 1979. Mrs. Barsley, now remarried, is his widow. He's thought to have been the last surviving member of the Muggletonian sect. Philip Noakes was a devout private man who, while tolerating his wife's orthodox Christianity and that of his children, nonetheless believed that this man, Lodowick Muggleton, was not a mere London tailor, but a disciple of God, a mystical divine, and a prophet. In February 1652, Muggleton's cousin, John Reeve, also a London tailor, had a visitation. God appeared before him in a vision.
Oh, praise to my God, and his prophets I'll sing, since they unto me such glad tidings did bring.
John Reeve, said the Lord, I have chosen thee to be my last messenger for a great work unto this bloody and unbelieving world, and I have given thee Lodowick Muggleton to be thy mouth. I have put the two-edged sword of my spirit into thy mouth, that whomever I pronounce blessed through thy mouth is blessed to eternity, and whomever I pronounce cursed through thy mouth is cursed to eternity. Not unnaturally, John Reeve, who lived in Bishopsgate in London, rushed round to see his cousin Lodowick to tell him the good news. They were the Lord's missionaries, bound for a life of cursing and blessing those around them, part of the astonishing religious and cultural ferment that was England in the middle of the 17th century.
Before 1640, England was a country which was run by the Church of England. Every Englishman had to be a member of the church, had to go to its services every Sunday. It's a legal offence not to go. After the end of the war, there was an extraordinary outburst of free religious discussion. Sects came up from underground and could preach in the public. The censorship broke down, which had been very strict before 1640. Anything could get into print in the later 40s and early 50s. You got a proliferation, an extraordinary number of hitherto totally unheard of ideas, like levellers advocating democracy, diggers advocating communism, ranters advocating free love, all of this in print, of course. And so there was a sense, particularly in the army and in London, that ordinary people could think about, talk about, decide their own destiny, particularly among artisans and semi-educated people. There was this extraordinary ferment of speculation, discussion, argument, which took religious forms. The army took over power from 47 and 49. The king was executed as a traitor to the people of England, extraordinary thing to say in a society in which the king ruled by divine right. So that anything, it seemed, could go from then onwards. Muggletonians, the Quakers and the Ranters, the Baptists, Congregationalists were all taking part in this, a free-for-all discussion.
What did the Muggletonians believe in? One God for a start. There was no Trinity. God was 5 feet tall. He inhabited a heaven just 6 miles above the Earth's surface, in a cosmos where sun, moon and stars were the size they appeared to be to man on Earth. When a man died, his soul died with him, to be resurrected only at the last trump. But above all, the Muggletonians believed this. John Reeve and Lodowick Muggleton were prophets, with a unique power to recognize those who were and who were not their disciples. Those who were, they blessed. Those who strayed from the path, they cursed. You either were a Muggletonian or you weren't. There was no evangelizing, no preaching, no attempts to convert.
The start of the sect was God speaking to Reeve. But Reeve died in 58, and Muggleton lived on another 30-odd years. So Reeve started things off, but the fact that the sect survived was due to Muggleton, who was a very great organizer. I sometimes draw the perhaps fallacious analogy of Lenin and Stalin. Reeve was Lenin, who had the ideas and did the initial job. Stalin was the man who cashed in, rewrote the history with himself in a more prominent part in it than had actually happened, and was a very good organizer. Muggleton certainly was extremely good at holding his small flock together. It's all done by correspondence. He didn't travel or move around. But everybody wrote in to him for advice and guidance on moral problems, and he gave them very commonsensical advice.
Did this habit of public cursing make them particularly unloved or not?
It made them unloved among those whom they cursed, rather naturally. It had initially quite an awe-inspiring effect, I think. A couple of people died after being cursed, and in the very early stages they cursed a gentleman. And that was commented on, that ordinary artisans had the impertinence to damn to all eternity a gentleman. One didn't really differentiate between religion and politics in the 17th century. If you argued in favour of democracy, you did that because there was something of God in all men. I mean, everything was expressed in religious terms, and you took your arguments from the Bible.
In November 1974, Professor Hill wrote a long article about Milton in the Times Literary Supplement. 3 pages of closely argued text suggesting that the great 17th century poet-philosopher was in fact a man of extraordinarily radical political views. He was, Hill wrote, the first public defender of regicide in 1649, the last public defender of republicanism in 1660. And of all the radical fringe groups that sprang up during his life, none was closer to Milton, Hill discovered, than the Muggletonians. Well, the article provoked a storm of controversy. Letters cascaded into the TLS office denouncing Hill for associating Milton with what was merely, to many people, a posse of lunatics. But then in March 1975, the historian E.P. Thompson weighed in to defend Hill. He had been studying Muggletonian thought for the previous 10 years, specifically in relation to their influence on the 18th century visionary William Blake. But one paragraph, the most important, was the last in his letter. The Muggletonians, Thompson wrote, survived into this century with adherents in London and Derby. But what is of more importance is that the sect treasured a library which included 17th century manuscripts. There's no evidence that I know of which proves that these were destroyed in the war. It's possible they may still exist. Their recovery and preservation in a national collection would be of real importance. Well, E.P. Thompson's words turned out to be prophetic. They were prophetic because the archive did exist. The hallowed books and records of 2.5 centuries of Muggletonian worship had been stored by Philip Noakes, the apple farmer, in a warehouse in Tunbridge Wells. Mr. Noakes had been the last trustee of the Muggleton sect, and during the war he had rescued all these precious papers from the sect's rooms in London, and they remained undisturbed and undiscovered in deepest Kent until a chance encounter, one that was to have a profound effect on the lives of Mr. Nokes's family, his wife, his 2 daughters, and his son-in-law, Martin Johnson. Mr. Johnson was at a cocktail party where the Times Literary Supplement article was being discussed and E.P. Thompson's interest in the Muggletonian archive was being talked about. The Muggletonians, he said, sure they exist. Martin arranged a meeting between Professor Thompson and Mr. Nokes. Thompson travelled down to Tunbridge Wells and eventually won the confidence of Nokes. At first, Nokes was reluctant to talk about Muggletonianism. Thompson had to convince him his interest was purely historical. It took many months, but in the end, Mr. Nokes agreed. The archive could be seen.
We arranged for him to come down to the store, first of all. Well, the store was very dark and the things were packed very, very tightly. They had to light matches and he realised that there were, precious things there. He was amazed that they were in such good condition. And he then asked us if we could have them somewhere where he could go through them and catalogue them. Well, fortunately, I knew somebody who had a cellar in Tunbridge Wells, a really big cellar. So we asked them, and we had them put in the cellar. And then E.P. Thompson came for the weekend, and we spent the weekend unloading all these boxes. All these books came out, all these manuscripts. And he'd say, "My God, my goodness," he was really excited. And then there were 6 bushel boxes with the manuscripts in, and some of them older books. And he just said, "You can't leave them here." So we took them home, and then our lounge was littered with manuscripts and books, and he was lying on the floor, and he took a whole lot up to bed with him. I don't think he slept a wink that night.
Professor William Lamont picks up the story. He took over from E.P. Thompson, who had other demands on his time. Lamont's fascination, like Thompson's, was in the newly discovered Muggletonian archive, now in the British Library.
The Muggletonians have hitherto only surfaced as a kind of rather bizarre name, featuring just on the periphery of events. For the first time ever, we've got a continuous record of a small group, tiny in numbers, but we're seeing it from the inside, and I think in many ways it can help us to understand the 17th century better.
What was the maximum number of Muggletonians ever recorded at any one time?
Well, I think the nearest we can get to that is that we know that 248 Muggletonians attended the funeral of Lodowick, and that may well have been their peak. From then on, it's downhill all the way. So I think it is important to realise that we're talking about a very small movement indeed. We must keep it in proportion. Muggletonianism was not the secret religion of Englishmen in the 17th and 18th century. It was a very, very small minority. The amazing thing about it is that it survived as long as it did because no effort was made to convert. This is very important. It was true of the first Muggletonian, it was true of the last.
By the 19th century, the dwindling band of Muggletonians had established a library in New Street, Bishopsgate, the site of Lodowick's birth. They devoted themselves to a gigantic publishing task, printing and reprinting all the divine works of the 2 great prophets.
Macaulay, you see, had Muggleton as a notorious tippler. Now, this is quite wrong, but it's based on the fact that the Muggletonians met in pubs. This was the place where they could be safe. They would hire a room, and there they would discuss together the teachings of the prophets, and particularly in the 18th century, the custom grew of what they called the divine songs. And they would have their rather bad doggerel hymning the praises of Muggleton and Reeve to the tune of the national anthem or well-known folk songs. So that as far as the pub was concerned, all they could hear were some patriotic Englishmen having a good night out. But in fact, they were paying their respects to the prophets of the 17th century, a rather touching sort of little vignette, really.
John Reeve is God's prophet, I clearly do see, and Lodowick Muggleton too. God chose them that they might his mysteries declare to all those whom he doth love true. For when to the truth he had set to his seal, he then is assured God's blessed him.
Some beliefs lingered. As late as the 19th century, one Muggletonian, Isaac Frost, was willing to risk ridicule from the scientific community by publishing his faith in the Muggletonian view of astronomy, their belief in a geocentric universe, the stars, the sun and the moon tiny, and floating only a few miles above the Earth's surface.
I think one of the great problems for the historian of 17th century England is, first of all, of assuming that they are very like the 19th century, the confusion, say, of Victorian nonconformity with Stuart Puritanism, which are very different sort of animals. But with the Muggletonians, there's no danger of us looking at them as just normal sort of beings. The danger's the other way. Now, this time, we're able to see it from the inside. We're able to see what 18th and 19th century followers made of the doctrine.
The story might have ended there, but for the fact that hundreds of bound Muggletonian textbooks have now found their way up to York to an antiquarian dealer there who has taken charge of Philip Noakes's collection. These, then, are the remains of the curious and charming beliefs of John Reeve and Lodowick Muggleton. Just boxes and boxes of dusty old books, tomes, dissertations, breviaries, and hymnals. Far more, in fact, than there ever were Muggletonians who were likely to read them or sing from them. The printers must have been optimistic men, imagining a flourishing church bound for great things. But in fact, these boxes stand as testimony to the public failure of a very private belief. It might have remained wholly private and wholly forgotten, but for a series of lucky accidents. The article in the Times Literary Supplement, a chance conversation over cocktails, the foresight of the historian E.P. Thompson. Now it's very much public property. These books are going to scholars all over the world. A window's suddenly been opened on religious life in 17th century England. But one intriguing question remains. Was Philip Noakes of Mapfield really the last Muggletonian? Or are there others out there, perhaps, for whom these books are holy writ, and for whom Lodowick Muggleton was the last true prophet?
That report by Simon Winchester. And if we're wrong and there are any more Muggletonians, we'd like to hear from them. For the uninitiated who wish to know more, Professors Hill and Lamont have just published a book on the Muggletonians. And now from the world